I only needed shelter, but that old Spindle knew something about my family.
No coat worth pawning, no wages coming, no room to return to, just a canvas tool roll, and $5 she had hidden beneath a loose boot sole. And with that $5, she bought a forgotten feather duster maker's loft outside Lemont, Cook County, Illinois, erased from county trade maps in 1919. The north wall leaned 6 inches outward. Half the roof had opened to the weather. Condemned on October 3, 2022, it was marked for demolition before the spring thaw. Inside, a riveted brass cap sealed a hollow maple twine spindle, untouched for generations, holding money, a silver feather, and the reason her grandfather had never spoken of Chicago. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Mae Whitcomb had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Rockford, she measured winter by frost on the nail heads above her bed, hunger by mustard spread thin on bread, and safety by the steps between the kitchen table and back door. Rooms spoke through angles. A sagging shelf warned before it fell. Her father left when she was 6, taking his Union jacket and the better socket set. Her mother, Elaine, remained, but survival had narrowed her. She saved grocery receipts and rubber bands and could study a fever without touching Clara's forehead. The one place Clara was not required to become smaller was her grandfather, Silas Whitcomb's carriage house near Belvedere. Silas repaired church pews, library ladders, and wooden cases whose owners insisted the scratches mattered. Every Saturday, he heated coffee on a dented hot plate, while Clara swept walnut curls beneath the bench. He taught her to sight along a board, test wrought with a chisel handle, and sharpen steel until it caught light without flashing. At noon, they ate apples over the scrap bin. Then he let her choose one damaged object to mend. He never took the work from her hands. He only moved the lamp closer. Wood tells the truth slowly, Silas once said. He meant that pressure, water, heat, and neglect always left a record, but a patient hand could read it without accusation. He died during Clara's final year of high school while sleet ticked against hospital windows. Elaine sold the carriage house contents before Clara returned. The bench, planes, stones, and cedar tool chest went to an estate buyer. Clara kept only a folding rule found beneath the passenger seat. 5 years later, she worked at Halpern Architectural Millwork on Chicago's west side, trimming door stiles and repairing sash for buildings wealthier than anyone on the floor. Director Martin Halpern wore polished shoes into the saw room and controlled it through pauses. He initialed time cards in green ink, locked supply cages before lunch, and watched workers count screws. When payroll ran late, he blamed banks. Mahogany vanished through the loading dock under invoices no carpenter had seen. The collapse came on a Thursday in November. Halpern did not appear. A state notice hung crooked on the glass door, and the final month's wages were gone with him. By midnight, Clara's landlord had set her canvas tool roll on the frozen stoop beside a chipped blue mixing bowl, the one object she had carried from childhood. "You cannot stay here. Another night, Clara. Leave now." 8 words. He closed the door before the hallway heat could escape. Elaine stood behind the lace curtain across the room. Clara could see the pale oval of her face and one hand resting on the radiator. She did not raise it. The curtain settled back into place. Clara put the bowl inside the tool roll, tied the straps twice, and walked toward the bus line, while freezing mist silvered her hair. For 6 weeks, she moved south and west by whatever fare she could spare. In Cicero, she slept beneath a laundromat vent until the owner left coffee at 5. In Berwyn, she took 2 nights in a parking garage stairwell, waking when tires crossed the joints. In Aurora, A church basement admitted women after 7. In Joliet, she slept upright in the Amtrak room with the folding rule inside her sleeve. Her money fell from 38 borrowed dollars to 21, then 12. She bought oatmeal, transfers, and dry socks. By the 6th Monday, $5 remained beneath her boot sole. Cold made every decision exact. She washed in library restrooms, dried her cuffs under hand blowers, and studied bulletin boards for day labor. At the Joliet Public Library, a radiator clanked beside the local history shelves. While copying a warehouse address, she noticed a classified sheet behind a piano lesson notice, County Disposal. Tax forfeited structure. Former Whitcomb Feather Works Loft. $5 quitclaim, cash only. Buyer assumes all risk. The surname held her still. Beneath the listing, someone had drawn a line through the demolition estimate and written, Final claim date, December 19th. The property lay beyond Lemont, near the old drainage canal, reachable by bus, then 11 miles on foot. At the bottom was a county clerk's extension and one sentence typed in red, No interior inspection permitted. Clara read it 3 times. She unfolded Silas's rule across the table, its brass joints dark from his fingers, and placed her last bill beside it. The 2 objects were almost the same length. At closing time, she called the clerk from the lobby phone. Then she bought a one-way ticket toward Cook County, kept 83 cents for food, and stepped into the evening, carrying everything that had not yet been taken from her. By dawn, the road to the forgotten loft would begin under her feet. The bus carried Clara northeast before sunrise, its heater breathing lukewarm air over windows clouded by 40 silent passengers. She rode as far as Lockport, counting each stop against the coins in her palm, then walked the shoulder of State Street until warehouses gave way to frozen drainage fields. Her ticket had taken everything but 83 cents. 11 miles remained, though the county clerk's directions would later add 3 more. By afternoon, the temperature had fallen to 18 degrees. She spent that night in an abandoned hay barn near New Avenue, buried beneath loose timothy, while wind moved through missing boards and lifted the dry stalks against her face. At first light, she shook the hay from her hair and kept walking. Lemont appeared gradually, not as a skyline, but as chimney smoke, church stone, and the iron geometry of the railroad bridge. Along Stevens, she passed Kozak's Shoe Repair, the Old Canal Bakery, Morrow Hardware and Feed, Doris Bell's Corner Cafe, and a narrow shop called Sable & Sons Watchmakers, where 12 stopped clocks faced the glass. Men were salting the sidewalks. A woman sweeping flour from the bakery threshold looked at Clara's tool roll, then at her thin coat, but asked no question. The Cook County Satellite Clerk's office occupied the rear half of a former savings bank. Its marble floor had been patched with squares of gray linoleum, and the radiators struck every few minutes as if something inside them wanted out. Behind the counter sat a broad-shouldered woman with one clouded eye and a silver pencil clipped vertically through her hair. Her brass nameplate read, Mrs. Eleanor Voss Deputy County, Clerk. Clara gave her name and slid the classified notice across the counter. Mrs. Voss read it without touching the $5 bill. You understand there is no title warranty. Yes, ma'am. You understand the structure is condemned. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not restore the road. Well, or electrical service. Yes, ma'am. You understand that if you are injured there, nobody in this office is responsible. Yes, ma'am. The clerk removed her spectacles. One lens had been repaired at the hinge with copper wire. Do you understand what condemned means, Miss Whitcomb? It means they have stopped waiting for someone to repair it. Mrs. Voss looked at her for several seconds, then turned toward a wall of steel drawers. The deed was one page, brittle at the edges, and crowded with descriptions written before roads had dependable names. Clara signed beneath the words, Buyer assumes all defects, known, and unknown. Mrs. Voss pressed a heavy brass stamp into a red pad, leaned her full weight over it, and left the county seal embedded in the paper like a small bruise. She finally took the bill. "Old Archer Road west to Derby," she said. "South past the quarry turn. At the split, keep left on Bluff Road. You will see a collapsed stone culvert and 2 black walnut trees. The lane is beyond them, though I doubt you will call it a lane." She folded the deed into thirds, but stopped before handing it over. "Whitcomb," she said. "Was Silas Whitcomb your father?" "My grandfather." The pencil in her hair shifted as she leaned back. "He came here once, long ago. 1987, maybe 88. Asked for the same parcel file." Clara did not reach for the deed. What did he want with it? He wanted to know who held the taxes. "I told him the Whitcomb Feather Works had been abandoned since 1919 and transferred through 3 failed companies. He asked whether anything had been removed." "What did you tell him?" "That the county had boarded the place and forgotten it." Mrs. Voss opened a ledger beneath the counter. The pages smelled faintly of dust and binding glue. She found a line of green ink and turned the book toward Clara. Silas Whitcomb's signature crossed the visitor column, firmer than it had been in the final years of his life. "He stood exactly where you were standing," Mrs. Voss said. "He had a cedar tool chest with him, would not let me help carry it." Clara placed one finger near the signature, but did not touch it. "Did he go to the property?" He asked for directions. "Whether he reached it, I cannot say." Mrs. Voss glanced toward the dark bank windows. "He returned before closing and sat on that bench for almost an hour." The chest was gone. The radiator struck twice. Why did he never claim the place? The fee was larger then. Back taxes, recording charges, liens. More than a careful man could hide from his family. Mrs. Voss slid the deed forward. Today the county wants $5 and 1 less liability. Clara put the folded paper inside her shirt, between the flannel and her skin. At the door, Mrs. Voss called after her. "Miss Whitcomb." Clara turned. The clerk opened the middle drawer of her desk and placed the $5 bill inside, without closing it. "Bring me a photograph before they tear it down." Outside, the day had hardened into a white sky. Clara followed Archer Road past the limestone walls of the old quarry district, then turned where the clerk had told her. Salt trucks had not reached Bluff Road. The snow there held narrow tracks from a single pickup and the looping prints of rabbits. Near the culvert, she met an elderly man splitting kindling beside a mailbox marked Pike. He wore 1 yellow glove and 1 brown one. A red hound stood behind him, its muzzle white and its tail held perfectly level. "You looking for the feather place?" the man asked. Clara nodded. "Road ends before it gets there. I can walk." The hound approached and pressed its nose against her tool roll. "That is Otis," the man said. "He dislikes liars and thunder. Hasn't decided about you." Clara let the dog smell her hand. "Are you Mr. Pike?" "Howard Pike. House beyond the walnuts. If the floor gives way, shout toward the creek. Sound carries in winter." He turned back to his splitting block, then added, "Do not drink from the well until you boil it." The 2 walnut trees rose from the snow, half a mile farther on, their trunks thick enough that Clara could not have circled either with both arms. Between them, a track disappeared beneath buckthorn and bent grass. She followed it, with her shoulder lowered against the branches. The loft stood on a shelf of ground above the canal marsh. It was longer than she had imagined, perhaps 28 feet by 42, built of rough limestone on the first level and weathered timber above. Cedar shingles remained on the southern roof slope, though the northern half had peeled back to black felt and exposed lath. A brick chimney leaned away from the ridge. Over the double doors hung a gray wooden sign whose surviving letters read, Whitcomb Feith Works. The north wall did lean. From the lower corner to the eave, the siding had moved outward enough to show a dark seam against the stone foundation. Someone had braced the wall with two timbers, but both had sunk into the soil. The padlock on the front door had rusted open years before. Clara lifted it from the hasp and pushed. The door moved 3 inches, stopped, then gave with the sound of wood tearing away from ice. Cold air came out carrying the sweet, spoiled odor of old hide glue. Feather fragments stirred across the floor. Gray, cream, and black filaments, so dry they broke beneath the breath entering behind her. She tasted dust before she realized her mouth was open. The front room contained a scarred counter, 2 bins, and a row of wooden handles suspended from nails. Water had stained the plaster into brown islands. Beneath the counter lay a brass ferrule, crushed flat as a coin. She moved into the back room, where the roof had held. There the darkness seemed warmer, though her breath remained visible. A long workbench ran beneath 4 windows. Iron binding stands were bolted to its edge, their gears furred with rust. Bundles of ostrich plumes had collapsed inside paper sleeves, and loose barbs clung to Clara's cuffs with a faint electrical pull. When she brushed them away, they rose again. The maple twine spindle stood up at the far end of the bench, larger than a barrel, and mounted on an iron axle. Its pale wood had blackened around the handholds. Clara pushed it once. It did not turn. Somewhere inside the wall, a mouse scratched and became still. Wind entered through broken glass with a low bottle note. The remaining panes trembled, and from the loft above came one measured creak, then another, as the building adjusted to her weight. Clara found the staircase sound enough to climb, but not yet to trust. The upper room was full of broken handles, nesting straw, and a drift of feathers caught beneath the eaves. Through the roof gap she could smell snow approaching, metallic and clean. She returned downstairs before dark. There was no wood ready for burning and no safe chimney to carry smoke, so she spread discarded wrapping paper over the least warped section of floor. The canvas tool roll became her pillow. She ate half a roll the bakery woman had slipped into her hand as she left town and saved the rest for morning. Night entered without ceremony. The loft clicked, whispered, and settled around her. Once, something moved beneath the bench. Once, the sign outside struck the wall. Clara kept one hand inside the tool roll, resting against Silas's folding rule, while feathers crossed the floor in the moonlight, like small, pale creatures searching for a place to land. What is soft enough not to scratch can still be strong enough to clean. At first light, Clara tied a strip of cloth around her mouth and began with the well. Its stone curb stood behind the loft beneath a lid swollen tight by rain. She worked the edge loose with Silas's folding rule, then lowered a rusted bucket on fraying rope. The water came up clear enough to mirror the sky, but a green film clung to the iron handle. She boiled every cup in a dented enamel pot found beneath the counter. The outhouse leaned toward the creek but remained usable after she shoveled out leaves and nailed a scrapboard across the worst gap. Inside the loft, she learned the floor by sound. 3 planks near the front door answered with hollow knocks. The strip beneath the eastern windows groaned but held. One board beside the binding bench gave a thin, splintering complaint, and she marked it with chalk. On the 4th morning, she walked back to town. Morrow Hardware and Feed smelled of kerosene, cedar shavings, and burlap warmed by a pot-bellied stove. Tin scoops hung above open bins of nails. The owner stood behind the counter wearing spectacles, with one lens thicker than the other, which made his left eye appear watchful and enormous. "Jonas Morrow," he said, "you are the woman at Whitcomb's. Clara Whitcomb." He glanced at the tool roll on her shoulder. Howard Pike says you slept there. I did. That chimney has not drawn since before my father bought this store. I know. No, you know it is dirty. That is not the same thing. Clara placed the deed on the counter, then a list written on the back of the classified notice. I need enough to make one room safe. I can work off the debt. Jonas read the list, turned it over, and read it again. I do not employ anyone. Then open an account. His enlarged eye remained on her while the other traveled toward the frost on her cuffs. What would secure it? The building. That building would not secure a sack of turnips. My labor, then. He removed his spectacles and polished them with the hem of his shirt. $20, no more. Paid when you have it. Clara nodded. He reached beneath the counter and added a thin, grease-stained booklet titled Farmhouse Repairs, without machinery. My father gave these away after the war, he said. Most people used them to level tables. She bought a stiff chimney brush for $3.85, 50 feet of quarter-inch rope for $1.20, a galvanized bucket for $1.65, 2 pounds of cut nails for $2.10, stove cement for 85 cents, and a second-hand claw hammer for $1.50. Jonas wrote every price in a ledger and drew a single line beneath the total. No interest, he said. Interest makes neighbors into bankers. Back at the loft, Clara opened the repair manual beneath the least broken window and studied the chimney chapter twice before touching a tool. The fireplace throat was blocked by a nest packed with leaves, feathers, and blue string. She removed it with tongs improvised from 2 lengths of barrel hoop, then held a candle beneath the flue. The flame bent toward the room, no draw. She tied the chimney brush to the rope, wrapped a scarf around her nose, and climbed onto the southern roof slope by setting a ladder against the stone wall. The cedar shingles flexed beneath her knees. At the ridge, she crawled toward the chimney, looped the rope around her waist, and looked down the flue. Black creosote narrowed it to less than half its width. She lowered the brush 6 feet, pulled it up, and worked in short strokes until soot rose from the fireplace below in soft collapses. The brush struck something solid near the smoke shelf. Clara climbed down, cleared a brick fragment by hand, then returned to the roof. She repeated the descent 12 times. Creosote came loose in hard glazed scales and granular heaps that shone like crushed coal. Twice the rope snagged. Once the brush head separated, forcing her to lower a bent hook until she caught its wire eye. She began before 9 and finished after 4, with black dust inside her sleeves and the muscles of her hands trembling. At the hearth, she sealed a finger-wide joint with stove cement, waited until the surface dulled, then lit 1 twist of newspaper. The flame leaned inward. Clara added 2 dry splinters from a broken handle, then a piece of oak taken from the collapsed sign brace. Smoke rose cleanly through the throat. The fire remained small, but warmth reached her face with such directness that she lowered her hands and watched it without moving. She boiled well water and cooked oatmeal in the enamel pot, stirring in the saved half of the bakery roll after it had gone hard. It was the first hot food she had eaten in 3 days. She sat on the stone hearth with the bowl between her palms, while the room changed from dangerous cold to merely cold. That afternoon she began the inventory. She chose only what could still speak through use: an iron binding stand, with a hand wheel shaped like a 5-petaled flower, 6 ash handles cut with shallow circular grooves, a shallow copper kettle filmed with hardened hide glue, 3 brass ferules nested inside one another, a bundle of waxed jute twine stiff as wire, a feather-sizing comb with graduated teeth, a tin of powdered rosin, and the great maple spindle at the end of the bench. The spindle stood 42 inches high and nearly 2 feet across. Unlike the surrounding equipment, it had not been bolted down. Its axle entered an iron frame, but the frame itself rested loose on wooden runners. Clara brushed the dust from the rim and found hand-cut numbers marking intervals around the circumference. She struck the side with the hammer handle. The lower half answered with the dense note of solid maple. Near the top, the sound changed. She struck again. Hollow. Clara measured the spindle, estimated its volume, then tested its weight by slipping a length of pipe beneath one runner. Solid maple of that size should have resisted her. Instead, one end rose with steady pressure from her shoulder. She lowered it carefully and turned the handwheel. The axle moved 1/4 turn before stopping against hardened twine buried in the groove. She cut the jute away strand by strand, saving each intact length. When the spindle finally rotated, a narrow seam appeared near the upper rim. It did not follow the grain. Clara cleaned the seam with the back of a knife and uncovered the edge of a cedar disc set flush into the maple. 3 darkened screws held it in place. Their slots were filled with wax and sawdust. The repair manual offered nothing for a concealed door, so she worked from what Silas had taught her. First, she warmed the screw heads with a nail heated at the fire. Then she pressed the driver down before turning, keeping the force vertical so the old brass would not strip. The first screw yielded. The second squealed once. The third required oil and 20 patient minutes. The cedar disc remained fixed. Clara ran her fingertips around its edge until she found a small depression beneath the axle. She inserted the folding rule's brass tip and pushed. The panel lifted less than an inch. Air escaped from the hollow core carrying cedar, wax, and the dry mineral smell of old coins. She widened the opening with 2 wooden wedges. Inside lay 4 parcels wrapped in oilcloth and tied with black cord. Beneath them sat a rectangular tin box. A narrow leather case had been wedged vertically against the inner wall. Clara removed the case first. It contained 3 tools: a bone-handled bodkin, a pair of curved feather shears, and a small, grooving knife, whose steel remained bright beneath a film of grease. Each tool bore the same 5-petaled mark as the iron handwheel. The first oilcloth parcel held bundled ostrich plumes, compressed but not brittle, their shafts wrapped in tissue printed with South African shipping marks. The second held spools of waxed twine, pale amber and black. The third contained brass and tinned ferrules, sorted by diameter. The fourth parcel was heavier. Clara set it on the bench and untied the cord. Inside were canvas rolls stitched into narrow pockets. Coins filled them edge to edge. She did not pour them out. She carried the rolls to the floor, spread a clean flour sack beneath them, and opened one pocket at a time. Silver dollars first, many worn smooth at the cheek. $50 followed, then quarters, then Indian head cents darkened almost black. Between 2 coin rolls lay a purple heart in its small hinged case. The ribbon faded at the fold. Engraved on the reverse were the initials TEW, and the year 1918. The tin box contained paper currency, wrapped in waxed cloth, a folded letter, a narrow handbook bound in oilskin, and a small ostrich feather cast in solid silver. The feather was no longer than Clara's little finger. Each barb had been cut separately, so delicate that the metal seemed capable of moving. She left the letter folded. Instead, she counted. The silver dollars totaled 6,114. Half dollars and quarters added $1,086. The cents amounted to $12. Paper notes, most in denominations of 10 and 20, came to 13,188. She counted again from the beginning. The total was $21,800, exactly. Clara wrote the figure on the flour sack with a carpenter's pencil, then crossed it out because the sight of it seemed careless. She replaced every coin in its pocket, folded the paper notes along their existing creases, and set the metal above the unopened letter. Outside, evening had lowered itself over the marsh. She carried the tin box through the back door and sat on the stone well curb. The canal water beyond the reeds had gone black, except where the last light caught a narrow current. Ice moved against the bank with a sound like plates being placed gently in a cupboard. The letter remained inside. Clara held the silver feather in one closed hand and watched the water until her fingers warmed it. She had spent 6 weeks guarding $5. Now a fortune waited behind her, along with a voice she was not yet ready to hear. When darkness erased the opposite bank, she returned to the loft, sealed the cedar disc loosely over the spindle, and placed the tin box beside her bed of paper. What is soft enough not to scratch can still be strong enough to clean. Morning entered through the eastern windows and laid 4 pale rectangles across the workbench. Clara heated water, washed the soot from her fingers, and opened the tin box. The handwriting on the folded envelope stopped her before the words did. Its narrow capitals, the hooked lower edge of each W, and the deliberate space after a comma were the same marks Silas had made in the margins of repair manuals. She broke no seal. The flap had been tucked beneath itself. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the spindle, then the roof has held longer than I expected, or you have been stubborn enough to stand beneath it anyway. Both possibilities give me comfort. My name is Silas Edwin Whitcomb. In March of 1987, Dr. Miriam Feld at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago told me that the weakness in my hands was amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She said plainly that the muscles would fail while the mind remained awake. I had repaired furniture for 42 years, and I understood what it meant when a structure could no longer obey the hand that knew it. This shop began with Elias Whitcomb, born in 1841 near Utica, New York, who came to Chicago after the fire and opened Whitcomb Featherworks in 1873. His daughter Ruth Whitcomb Hale, born in 1878, learned the binding tables and kept the accounts after her husband died in France in 1918. Her son, Thomas Elias Hale, moved the trade to this loft in 1921, though he kept the Whitcomb name above the door. Thomas's daughter, Margaret Hale Whitcomb, my mother, was born here in 1924 and carried the final box of finished dusters to a hotel buyer in Chicago on October 14, 1955, the exact day the trade closed. After that came more than 30 years of silence. My mother could not enter this building without seeing the men who had left it. Her brother, Thomas Edwin Whitcomb, was killed near the Meuse during the final weeks of the Great War. The Purple Heart was issued later, when the medal existed, and sent to the family. She kept it here because grief had already taken enough objects into parlors where nobody touched them. I came in 1987 because I meant to bring the tools home. I brought the cedar chest and filled it from this room. Then I understood that taking everything would turn the work into possessions. I hid the chest again beyond the back wall, beneath the limestone marker engraved with the 5-pedaled binding wheel. I left the money where Elias had concealed it through 4 generations of panic, fire, sickness, and unpaid invoices. The handbook will teach you what our family learned by failure. Wash usable plumes in water held between 105 and 110 degrees, with 1 part mild soap to 40 parts water. Rinse twice. Dry them in moving air for 18 hours, never against iron heat. Warm the binding wax until it softens at 145 degrees. Then work 2 parts beeswax to 1 part pine rosin into the jute. Lay the feathers in 3 graduated collars, turning the handle 1/8 of a revolution between bundles. Bind each collar for 7 full turns before crossing the knot beneath the groove. The static finish is made with wool, amber resin, and patience. Do not hurry it. The money is not payment for belonging to us. Blood alone has ruined many honest trades. Use what you need to make the place sound, then keep the remainder for the person whose hands arrive after yours. Inheritance is not owning what the dead owned. It is accepting the unfinished work without pretending they completed it. If you know me, forgive what I could not explain. If you do not, judge me by the sharpness of the tools and the dryness of the feathers. Those were the promises I still knew how to keep. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Silas Edwin Whitcomb. December 2nd, 1988. Clara read the letter twice. The second time, she slowed at the sentence about blood and work. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, pressing each line flat with the side of her thumb. She placed the letter beside the silver feather and carried Silas's folding rule through the back door. The ground behind the loft fell toward the marsh in 3 shallow terraces. Snow had hidden their edges, but a row of limestone chips showed near the foundation. Clara cleared them with the galvanized bucket until her knuckles struck a flat stone set upright beneath the back wall. A 5-pedaled wheel had been cut into its face. She knelt and dug along the lower edge. The marker shifted when she pulled. Behind it was a cavity lined with cedar boards and sealed by a warped panel. Clara worked the panel free and found the tool chest Silas had carried from the clerk's office 35 years earlier. Its leather handles had cracked, but the dovetailed corners remained tight. Inside lay 2 smoothing planes wrapped in wool, a narrow spoke shave, 4 chisels, an Arkansas stone, and a brass alcohol lamp with a cotton wick curled beneath its cap. She carried the lamp indoors, filled it with a small measure of denatured alcohol from the repair shelf, and trimmed the wick square. The first match failed. The second produced a low blue flame edged with yellow. It was not enough to warm the room. It was enough to place light on the tools. Clara sat beside it and remembered the people who had kept her moving without asking. For the story first, the laundromat owner in Cicero, who left coffee near the vent, the church custodian in Aurora, who unlocked the basement before the posted hour, the bakery woman who placed a roll in Clara's palm, Howard Pike warning her about the well, Mrs. Voss keeping the $5 bill instead of sending it into a county drawer, Jonas Morrow writing credit beneath her name without interest. None had rescued her. Each had made the next mile possible. Before the story moves forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they did not know how badly you needed it. Tell us what it was in the comments, if you can. A cup of coffee, an unlocked door, a warning spoken in time. Small things often carry more weight than the hands that offer them ever learn. That night, Clara wrapped the planes and chisels again, set the cedar chest beside her paper bed, and placed the letter beneath the silver feather on its lid. The alcohol lamp had gone dark, but its brass chimney retained a little warmth. She slept with one hand resting against the chest. The first snow came on December 3rd, 6 inches laid evenly over the marsh and the broken northern roof slope. Clara read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the stove, moving one finger beneath each sentence while meltwater tapped into a bucket behind her. The loft measured 28 by 42 feet. Allowing for pitch, overlap, and waste, she calculated 24 squares of cedar shingles, 3 rolls of felt, and nearly 30 pounds of galvanized nails. The full order exceeded her credit, so she bought enough to close the northern half and salvage sound shingles from the rear slope. Jonas Morrow carried the materials out himself. Before Clara left, he opened a drawer and handed her a roofing hatchet with a notched blade and a handle polished black by use. "My brother Edwin's," he said. "He will not ask for it back." Howard Pike arrived the following morning in a canvas coat whitened at the shoulders. He had roofed barns for 38 years and refused the coins Clara offered. "You can pay by listening. They worked 11 days. Clara sistered the split rafter with a straight length of fir, bolting it beyond the damaged section, while Howard tested the repair with his weight. They snapped a chalk line across the felt and laid each course with the joints staggered. Howard taught her to set a nail in 3 strokes, one to place it, one to drive it, and one to seat the head without bruising the shingle. The nail's proud. Clara checked it with her thumb. Pull it. She did. Wind stiffened the felt and stole 2 shingles from the ridge. On the 7th morning, sleet froze the ladder rungs, and they waited beneath the eave until noon, rather than pretend courage could improve traction. By December 15th, the final ridge cap lay straight against the sky. Snow began again before they climbed down, but none entered the loft. January opened the chimney from the outside. Once the soot was gone, Clara could see where frost had entered the brick. Several faces had spalled away in red flakes, and the mortar beneath them powdered between her fingers. She removed only the loose courses, numbering each sound brick and chalk before lowering it in a rope basket. Jonas sold her hydraulic lime and fire clay on the same account. She mixed 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fire clay for the inner joints, adding water slowly until the trowel left a clean ridge. The outer courses received plain lime mortar, so the stack could release moisture instead of trapping it. For 3 weeks, the temperature remained in the 20s. Clara worked barehanded when placing mortar because gloves dulled the pressure in her fingertips. Every 15 minutes, her hands went numb. She climbed down, held them near the stove until they ached, then returned before the batch stiffened. Howard inspected the crown but touched nothing. "Too wet," he said once. Clara scraped out the joint and began again. By late January, the chimney stood plumb enough to cast 1 unbroken shadow at noon. She let the mortar cure beneath damp burlap, then built a test fire, no larger than 2 joined fists. Smoke entered the throat, passed the repaired courses, and drew clean above the ridge. No gray thread escaped through the joints. Clara watched the flame for an hour before adding another piece of oak. The floorboards were white pine, wide enough to show the growth of trees cut before sawmills standardized patience. Many remained fixed with hand-cut rose-head nails, whose faceted heads had been driven below the grain. Clara rented Jonas's random orbit sander for $14 a day. Before starting, she set every proud nail with a punch and filled the deepest splits with pine slivers cut along the grain. Dust escaped through the cloth over her mouth and settled inside her ears. She made 3 passes, 80 grit to remove the gray surface, 120 to quiet the scratches, and 220 to close the final roughness. Around the binding stands she worked by hand, wrapping paper around a cork block so the old iron feet remained undisturbed. The boards changed beneath the dust. What had appeared nearly black became dark honey at first, then deepened toward mahogany after the first coat of oil. Clara wiped on 3 thin coats with folded cotton, removing every wet patch after 20 minutes. She left 48 hours between the last coat and her first careful step. One morning she woke unable to lift the sanding block. She carried no tool outside. At the marsh, a great blue heron stood in the shallows, with its neck folded close and 1 foot hidden beneath the water. Clara sat on the well curb until the bird opened its wings and crossed the creek. She did no work that day. The next morning, the floor accepted the final oil without blotching. In the afternoon light, the rosehead nails appeared like small, dark stars kept beneath the surface. There were 8 windows in all. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 retained an original pane dated in the old account book to 1788, its surface wavering with bubbles and faint vertical lines. Clara preserved that pane where it was. She removed the remaining sashes one at a time, marking each mortise before carrying it to the bench. Rotten cord came out in brown fibers. She replaced it with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, feeding it over the pulley, and tying a figure-8 knot at the cast-iron counterweight so the knot would tighten under load rather than slip. For the glazing, she warmed Diap 33 putty between her palms, rolled it into narrow ropes, and pressed a continuous bed into each rabbet. After setting the glass, she placed the points flat with the side of a chisel and drew the putty knife in one deliberate pass, leaving a bevel that shed water while remaining below the sightline from inside. The third sash rattled after installation. Clara removed it and found one pulley screw standing proud by less than 1/8 of an inch. She reset the screw, planed the edge twice, and rehung the weight. By the final window, February sunlight had begun to remain past 5. Clara lifted the lower sash, tested the balance, and watched it stop wherever she released it. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch. Its claws closed around the twig while its black cap turned first toward the glass and then toward Clara. It stayed through 3 quiet breaths before rising over the repaired roof. The walls had been finished in horsehair plaster over hand-split oak lath, and most of it still held because the builders had left room for the house to move. Near the chimney, however, heat and leaking water had loosened 3 patches. Clara's first repair fell before it dried. The second cracked from corner to corner. The third remained attached, but sounded hollow beneath her knuckles, so she removed it rather than let hope become another weak material. Jonas found an old bag of horsehair in his storeroom, saved from his father's upholstery work. Clara washed it, cut it to thumb-length fibers, and folded it into lime plaster until each handful resisted the trowel. She pressed on the scored scratch coat, forcing plaster between the lath so it curled behind the oak strips. After it tightened, she added a 3/8 inch brown coat and left it beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. The final coat measured 1/8 of an inch and was worked smooth, with a wooden float rather than polished flat. The new areas remained lighter than the old wall. Clara did not tint them. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it quietly, not as a promise she could prove, but as the standard by which she had mixed the lime. Doris Bell began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before Clara woke. Doris had flour permanently caught in the seams beside her fingernails and tied every bag with red and white butcher's string. Inside were heel ends of rye bread, bruised apples, soup in jars, and once a square of ginger cake wrapped in waxed paper. Clara carried 2 empty jars to the cafe and placed coins beside them. Doris pushed the money back with one finger. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." She did not ask whether the shop would reopen. She turned toward the griddle, and the conversation was finished. Caleb Pike arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with a white scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He split the fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths without being asked, setting aside the straightest pieces for handles. When Clara offered him 50 cents, he shook his head and drove the maul into the block. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all. He stacked the wood beneath the eave, tested the tarp knots twice, and rode away with the empty maul looped through his belt. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk from the Methodist parsonage to the canal road. He wore a black hat too large for his small head and tipped it whenever Clara was on the roof or at the well. One icy morning he stopped while she carried plaster water. "May honest work shelter you." 4 words. Then he lifted his hat and continued toward town, leaving 2 careful rows of footprints in the snow. Clara postponed the cellar until February 11th. The hatch lay beneath the rear stair, swollen into its frame and sealed by old paint. When it opened, cold air rose with the smell of limestone and earth. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot floor, paved in fieldstone. She carried the alcohol lamp below. At the center stood a dressed granite slab, smoother than the surrounding stones, and engraved with the 5-petaled craft mark. Its edges disappeared beneath the floor. Clara cleared the joints with a brush, then stopped. The slab was too deliberate to disturb merely because she had learned that hidden places sometimes rewarded persistence. She did not lift it. Under the third step, her lamp caught a straight edge where no straight edge belonged. A small oak box had been wedged behind the granite support. Clara eased it out with the grooving knife and found a brass key wrapped in linen. Its bow had been shaped like an ostrich feather, the barbs cut in shallow relief. Beneath the key lay a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the loft before the walnut trees had reached the roofline. She held a feather-sizing comb in one hand and looked into the camera with Clara's narrow mouth and level gaze. On the back, scratched through the black varnish, were the words, "Ruth Whitcomb, daughter of Elias, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the silver feather. She tried it in the cedar chest, the front door, the old account cabinet, and the tin box. It opened none of them. She left it where morning light could reach it, and did not pretend to know what it was for. By March, snow withdrew from the south wall in narrow gray bands. The creak grew loud enough to hear from the workbench, and green catkins appeared on the black walnut branches before any leaf opened. Clara cleaned the binding stand, but did not begin the full trade that spring. The handbook required judgment she had not yet earned. How to feel weakness in the feather shaft, how much tension waxed twine could bear before it cut the quill, how long resin should cool before it held without becoming brittle. She chose $1 silver from the cache for materials and recorded the date beside Silas's letter. She would practice on damaged feathers and short handles. Nothing made for sale, nothing carrying the Whitcomb name. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara completed the first feather duster she was willing to keep. The handle was turned from one of the walnut pieces Caleb had stacked beneath the eave. She cut 3 shallow binding grooves near the shoulder, sealed the wood with linseed oil, and let it cure for 10 days. The ostrich plumes had been washed at 108 degrees, rinsed twice, and dried 18 hours in the loft's moving air. She arranged them in 3 collars, shortest at the center and longest toward the ferrule, rotating the handle 1/8 turn between bundles. 7 wraps of amber waxed jute secured each layer. The final knot disappeared beneath a fitted brass sleeve. When she rolled the finished feathers against wool and passed them above the workbench, dust lifted from the wood without the barbs touching it. Clara stood still. Then she returned the duster to the rack and wrote the date beneath Silas's instructions. The loft no longer leaned toward collapse. A sistered frame supported the north wall. The chimney held through hard rain. Restored sash windows admitted wavering winter light, and the white pine floor reflected it in long, dark bands. Silas's planes rested above the bench, not as relics, but sharpened and ready. The brass key waited on the mantel until a January storm broke a dead limb from the larger walnut tree. Clara and Caleb cut the limb into lengths before ice could seal it to the ground. Where the branch had torn away, rain had exposed the edge of an oval brass plate fixed deep in the trunk. The plate bore a feather no wider than Clara's thumb. The key entered without resistance. Behind the plate was a copper-lined hollow, made when the tree had been young and covered as the trunk widened around it. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, protected by oilcloth. Beneath it was a note dated October 6, 1918, written by Ruth Whitcomb Hale, while her brother Thomas served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. Ruth had written that if he returned, the flag would be hung above the binding bench. If he did not, it should remain near the tree they had planted together, where no visitor would be asked to admire it. She wrote that Thomas hated ceremonies, loved peach preserves, and could bind a full carriage duster without breaking a single quill. The final line asked whoever found the note to carry his name once to a place where soldiers were remembered, then return home and do useful work. Clara unfolded the flag only far enough to confirm the stars. Caleb held the oilcloth away from the snow. Neither spoke until the cloth had been wrapped again. On November 11th, 2025, Clara carried Thomas Edwin Whitcomb's Purple Heart to Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery in Elwood. She stood near the memorial walkway at 11 in the morning, when the bells marked the armistice hour, and read his name once from Ruth's note. She did not leave the medal there. At home, she placed it with the flag in an archival box and returned both to the copper hollow. The brass plate closed beneath her hand. By spring, new bark had begun to darken around its edge. Of the $21,800, Clara used 4 coins. 1 bought feather soap and beeswax. 1 paid for the first bundle of legal, responsibly sourced ostrich plumes she could trace from seller to importer. 1 purchased brass sheet thin enough to form ferrules without splitting. The 4th paid Jonas the final balance in his ledger, though he objected that the account had already been settled through work. The paper currency and remaining coins went back into waxed cloth. Clara added a written inventory, Silas's letter, Ruth's tintype, and a copy of the repair accounts. She placed them inside the maple spindle and fitted the cedar disc properly this time. On its inner face she wrote 3 words, "For the next one." The shop reopened without announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for piano lessons and an advertisement for laying hens, hand-bound feather dusters repairs, and orders Whitcomb. Feather Works Bluff Road. The first order came from the watchmaker, who needed a soft brush for clock faces. The second came from a woman in Aurora who cleaned framed botanical prints at a small museum. By autumn, more than 40 names filled Clara's mailing list, written in pencil so no demand would appear permanent. She made no more than 6 dusters each month. When feathers were unsuitable, she rejected them. When a customer requested lacquer that would trap moisture in the walnut handles, she declined. She charged enough to replace materials, heat the loft, and keep 1 careful year between herself and hunger. Caleb returned on the 3rd anniversary of the roof repair, carrying a sign wrapped in a horse blanket. He had carved it from white oak and copied the surviving letters from the original board. The first line read, "Whitcomb Feather Works." Beneath it, in smaller letters, he had added, "Daughters." Clara ran her thumb through the carved ampersand. "There has only been 1 daughter here for years," she said. Caleb shrugged. He had grown broad through the shoulders but still carried the pale break in his eyebrow. "That is not what it means." They hung the sign above the doors using forged hooks Jonas had found in a coffee tin. From the road, the new words appeared modest beneath the old name, as though they had waited inside the grain for someone to cut away the surrounding wood. That evening, Clara opened the tin box and began a letter of her own. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote that the north wall had been repaired but should be checked after every thaw. She explained which wellstone shifted in wet years, where the chimney mortar dried too quickly, and why the 1788 pane must never be replaced, merely because its glass was uneven. She recorded the binding temperatures, the new suppliers, and the reason only 4 coins had been spent. She wrote that a trade could survive interruption, but not vanity. She wrote that whoever came next was free to continue the feather work, change it, or close the doors honestly. Then she described Doris's paper bags, Jonas's ledger, Howard's 3-stroke nail lesson, Reverend Boyd's prayer, and the boy who had understood the meaning of daughters before she did. She did not sign the letter immediately. Clara crossed the room and lifted the first duster from its rack. Dust had settled along the upper frame of Silas's tool chest, too fine to see except where winter light passed over it. She moved the feathers once across the wood. The dust rose without a mark. What is soft enough not to scratch can still be strong enough to clean. She returned to the bench, signed her full name, and dated the page. Outside, snow gathered on the walnut branches and along the repaired ridge. The creek moved beneath a skin of ice, carrying dark water toward Chicago. Inside, the brass lamp burned beside the maple spindle, while Clara folded the new letter along 3 deliberate creases. The feather duster maker's loft waits. It has always waited. Years later, Mrs. Voss's replacement would open the middle drawer of the clerk's desk and find an old $5 bill beneath a stack of recording receipts. Across its margin, in silver pencil, Eleanor Voss had written one name, one parcel number, and a final instruction: keep until she brings the photograph.